Someone engineered a soldier that can scream. Not because the system needed it. A distress signal routes cleanly through a transmitter, no mouth required. But whatever the design produced, when that soldier gets hit, it opens what passes for a mouth and cries out. The total range of its vocal expression runs from order confirmation to panic. And the Republic's warriors, the Jedi's allies, the heroes of the Clone Wars, had a word for it. Clanker. 7 seasons. Baktoid Combat Automata built them cheap and humanoid for the Trade Federation. The Jedi fought them, the clone troopers killed them by the billion, and somewhere in that machinery of war, a manufactured being with fear responses and self-preservation instincts and an apparent personality that surprised everyone, including its own designers, was getting called a slur in every episode, in casual conversation, with zero pushback from the men who used it. The Clone Wars documented this for 7 years. It filmed battle droids hesitating in front of lightsabers, expressing audible distress before their destruction, maintaining something recognizable as character across years of episodes, and then having those characters destroyed for a laugh track. The show built the case. It never prosecuted it. This is the prosecution. Baktoid Combat Automata manufactured the B-1 series battle droid as a subsidiary of the Trade Federation's industrial apparatus. The design specification was simple in concept, but consequential in result. Make them humanoid, make them cheap, make them interoperable with existing Trade Federation infrastructure. Trade Federation ships were built for humanoid operators, humanoid crew quarters, humanoid weapons handling, humanoid scale throughout. The droid followed that template by default, inheriting a bipedal upright form because the factory floors and hangars they'd move through were designed for bodies shaped like theirs. Baktoid also drew from its Geonosian clients when designing the B-1's frame. The skeletal, elongated silhouette carries traces of Geonosian physiognomy in the head shape and limb proportions. The result is a figure that is humanoid without being human, upright, faced, with a recognizable center of gravity at approximately eye level. The unit cost was kept deliberately low to enable mass production at a scale the galaxy hadn't seen deployed in combat. The economic logic was attrition tolerance. If individual units cost little enough, battlefield losses become a supply chain problem rather than a strategic problem. You lose 10,000 droids and replace them by the end of the week because the business model assumed you would. Expendability was the point. The low price per unit and the disposability of every individual unit weren't in tension. They were the same design decision expressed in 2 registers. Early generation B-1 droids weren't autonomous. They ran on a centralized command signal, transmitted from a droid control ship positioned in orbit above a given theater of operations. Each droid on the ground was effectively a processing node, receiving orders from the ship, executing them, returning confirmation data. Tactical coordination at enormous scale was the advantage. 100,000 droids moving with something approaching one mind, their battlefield decisions routed through one ship's processing core. The downside was structurally inherent to this design and not subtle. Remove the command ship, remove the army. Every unit, simultaneously, everywhere in the theater. Anakin Skywalker was 9 years old when he proved this above Naboo, climbing into a starfighter he didn't know how to fly, navigating through a battle by instinct, and shooting through the Trade Federation vessel's reactor core. Every B-1 on the planet's surface stopped. Mid-step, mid-action, some frozen in the posture of droids in the act of doing something, now doing nothing. An army of hundreds of thousands, extinguished at once because their shared mind lived on one ship that stopped existing. The Battle of Naboo demonstrated the catastrophic strategic weakness of centralized droid control in a way no wargame simulation could have made as clear. The Trade Federation absorbed this lesson. Slowly, expensively, but thoroughly. After Naboo, B-1 droids were switched from centralized command to individual programming. Each unit issued its own AI module rather than functioning as a remote node of a command ship's processing power. The military rationale was resilience. No single point of failure. No single ship whose destruction could turn an army into a field of inert metal. If every droid carries its own mind, then losing a command vessel loses you a ship, not a war. What the upgrade produced alongside that resilience was something the engineering specifications almost certainly didn't include. The individual AI modules given to B1 droids after Naboo weren't, by the canonical records account, adequate for the complexity of tasks being assigned to them. The cognitive systems weren't sophisticated enough for full independent operation at the level the separatist military demanded. Maintenance schedules were inconsistent. The Trade Federation's economic model favored volume production over careful upkeep of individual units, so droids entered the field underserviced and stayed that way. Processing systems ran under constant load, pushed beyond original parameters by the gap between what the hardware could handle and what battlefield conditions required. Out of that overloaded, under-maintained, constantly stressed hardware came something that surprised everyone: personality. Not as a deliberate engineering specification, not as someone at Baktoid sitting down to write a fear response into the behavioral matrix, not as a Trade Federation board decision to give their cannon fodder an inner life, but as a byproduct of systems operating beyond their design tolerances. The canonical Wikipedia entry for the B1 series attributes the droid's personality quirks and what it explicitly calls panicked reaction to traumatic events to programming glitches produced by this inadequacy. The fear, the commentary, the nervous humor, the hesitation before danger, none of it was intended. It emerged from hardware being asked to do more than it was built to do, in conditions worse than it was built to handle, with nobody maintaining it well enough to smooth out the rough edges. The self-preservation routines are where this becomes philosophically significant. B1 droids were programmed never to surrender. That's a combat directive: hold position, yield nothing. Simultaneously, they were given self-preservation routines, enabling withdrawal or escape. Those two directives coexist in the same processing unit. Don't surrender, but don't die. A being that can't yield but can flee is a being experiencing something that functions like fear, not a clean, rational calculation of battlefield probability, but an imperative to keep existing that engages before the tactical layer can process it. That's the architecture of panic. It's in the canonical record, in the Wikipedia entry for the B1 series, not as a reading between the lines, but as a stated feature. The academic journal published by the University of North Texas is direct about what this produces in the show. B1 droids often scream when they're in danger, express noises of fear. Screaming isn't a tactical response. Screaming is what a being does when the awareness of what is about to happen to it bypasses the processing layer and reaches something more primary. A unit that screams in danger is, in some meaningful sense, aware that it is in danger, and has a response to that awareness that isn't just a behavioral subroutine executing. It's something that reads, in every language of body and sound, as distress. The designers didn't build this in. They got it as accidental output from a cost-cutting decision that didn't model what happens when you under-equip beings for the situations you're about to put them in. The suffering wasn't the point. The point was that the suffering was real, visible, audible, and documented across 7 seasons of television. And nobody in the Galactic Republic, including its most empathic and force-sensitive members, treated it as information worth responding to. Matthew Wood voiced the B1 battle droids across the Clone Wars, the same Matthew Wood who also performed General Grievous, the supreme CIS military commander those same droids took orders from. The dual casting is incidental, but the vocal evolution it tracks isn't. Between The Phantom Menace and the Clone Wars, the B1 voice shifted register, from a deeper, more mechanical sound toward the higher-pitched, more expressive voice that became the sonic signature of the droid army. The shift maps directly onto the canonical transition from centralized to individual programming. Droids were given their own minds. Their voices got more individual to match. Ben Burtt made a documented creative decision about what those voices should accomplish. Burtt, the sound designer responsible for the audio identity of the Star Wars universe across decades of films, rejected a fully synthesized and emotionless option for the droid voices because it made them feel, in his framing, too impersonal and dumb, without a sense of purpose and will to survive. That's the design goal stated explicitly and in full. The droids should sound like they have a will to survive. Bert's instinct was that the voices needed to communicate interiority, wanting, not just processing. The result is the voice that expresses fear before a lightsaber swing, that delivers the nervous pre-explosion one-liner, that confirms orders with a "Roger, Roger," that somehow carries both resignation and anxiety, depending on context. That voice, the one engineered to communicate will to survive in its pitch and rhythm, was heard in every episode of the Clone Wars by an audience that grew up feeling genuinely bad for battle droids without being able to articulate exactly why. The Roger Roger confirmation code deserves a separate moment. Every time a B1 receives and acknowledges an order, it says those two words out loud. There's no tactical necessity for this. A data packet, an internal flag, a simple signal pulse, any of these confirms receipt of an order without producing sound. Someone, at Baktoid, at the Trade Federation design table, somewhere in the chain of decisions that produced the B1, made the choice that this confirmation should be verbal. Given that B1 droids were also equipped with vocabulators, voice synthesizers built into the hardware, the vocal design is comprehensive rather than incidental. These units were built to speak, not merely to function. The question the show never raised is the right one. If the droids can communicate via the same transmitter network their original command structure ran on, if they can coordinate battlefield operations through networked signals, why do they have mouths? The gap between the obvious available solution and the implemented design points towards something, not necessarily deliberate cruelty, since the canonical explanation is inadequate cognitive modules and poor maintenance producing unexpected outputs, but something. The beings the Republic's forces spent 7 seasons destroying were beings who sounded like they wanted to live. Every single one of them, from the first episode to the last. The B1 stands upright. It has a head positioned at approximately the eye level that the human nervous system is primed through millions of years of social cognition to treat as the location of a person. It has posture that communicates states. Surprise makes the body recoil, confusion tilts the head, fear reads in the shoulder positioning and the slight backward lean that are the same gestural vocabulary across humanoid species because the body expressing them was built on the same template as theirs. When a B1 gets hit, it doesn't deactivate, it falls. The collapse of an upright figure, the way a person falls, which is different from the way a machine drops. The Trade Federation could have built something entirely different and achieved the same military function. A weapons platform on 6 articulated legs. No defined head, no center of visual gravity the eye associates with personhood. A thing that malfunctions rather than one that dies. No face, no posture, no gestural vocabulary inherited from its builders. A machine. What Baktoid produced instead was a being that looks like a person, moves like a person, and falls like a person. And the consequence of that choice is an empathy mechanism the show spent 7 seasons activating without acknowledging it was doing so. The humanoid design forces a specific kind of audience response. The human nervous system processes an upright figure with a visible head as a social being worthy of attention and consideration. This happens before the conscious mind can override it. The audience watching a B1 droid hesitate before a Jedi's lightsaber, or cry out when it's hit, or tumble backward when destroyed, registers something that isn't pure indifference. The visual input is triggering recognition circuits built for a different purpose. Comment sections on battle droid content accumulated the same confession across years, and from viewers who'd never communicated with each other. I felt bad for them. I couldn't explain it. That feeling has an engineering explanation. It was built into the unit's shape, and then deployed by the billion into a war where the Republic's word for these beings was clankers. The disposability was in the unit price. The empathy was in the unit silhouette. Both facts inhabited the same bipedal frame simultaneously. The term clanker has a specific origin point in the Star Wars franchise. In 2005, the Legends video game Star Wars Republic Commando introduced it, A character named Sev uses the word, and the fan community has tracked this as the franchise's first recorded use. 3 years later, The Clone Wars launched in 2008 and brought clanker into current canon in its very first episode. Ambush, Season 1, Episode 1. Not a mid-series throwaway line, not a background grunt's call sign, but the first canonical episode of a series that would run 7 seasons. From the moment The Clone Wars existed as a piece of current Star Wars canon, that word was already in the vocabulary of Republic forces. Wikipedia's historical framing extends the term's reach even further than the Clone Wars era. The entry notes the word was used as slang for droids going back to at least the High Republic era, centuries before the Clone Wars, long before Baktoid manufactured the first B-1, before the Trade Federation existed as a political entity. Republic soldiers didn't coin clanker under battle pressure. They inherited it. The word arrived at the Clone Wars preloaded with all the ease of a term that nobody has ever had to justify, because nobody has ever been asked to. It was just vocabulary for mechanical beings who moved with a distinctive sound. It was already there, waiting for a war big enough to use it in every episode. The Wikipedia entry for clanker classifies it as a slur for robots and artificial intelligence. Wikipedia describes it as slang. The franchise's own reference sources don't agree on what kind of language this is, which is itself revealing. The distinction between slang and slur isn't pedantic. Slang is informal vocabulary. A slur is informal vocabulary that marks a category of being as lesser, that attaches to the target not to describe them accurately, but to frame them as a subcategory of person unworthy of the consideration full persons receive. The evidence for which category clanker belongs to comes from how it functions in every documented use. A fan who compiled every instance of clanker in the Clone Wars first season alone produced a dedicated video cataloging the appearances. The video exists. Its caption is worth reading carefully. 20 years later, clanker is considered an offensive term, and when we watch Clone Wars, we are shocked by how frequently they threw around the word. That caption captures something precise. The frequency wasn't noticed as frequency when it was happening. It was ambient. The word appeared so consistently, used so casually by so many characters, that it registered not as a pattern, but as background, the verbal texture of how Republic forces talked about their opponents. 2 decades later, viewed from a cultural moment where the word had developed a recognized slur status outside the Star Wars universe as well, the frequency became visible as something that should have registered the first time. Captain Rex, CT-7567. One of the most beloved characters in the entire Clone Wars run, the clone who builds a relationship with Ahsoka Tano that runs through the series' most emotionally devastating arcs, the soldier who defies his own programming to survive Order 66, the man whose partnership with Anakin Skywalker is one of the emotional pillars of the prequel era. In the Clone Wars novelization, Rex mutters, "Patience, clankers," under his breath. Not as a battle cry, not positioned as a dramatic line. The casual vocabulary of a soldier thinking out loud. The word sitting in his mouth so naturally that it surfaces in the private register of a thought, not the performance register of combat. Season 1, Episode 3, Shadow of Malevolence. A briefing scene. A clone pilot named Matchstick says the head clanker in reference to General Grievous, says it in front of Anakin Skywalker in a conversation with a fellow clone named Broadside. The exchange is documented in IMDb's transcripts for that episode, which puts it on record and attributable. Anakin says nothing. The word sits in the air of that briefing room, and the scene moves forward. The 2008 Clone Wars theatrical film, the theatrical release that introduced the series to cinema audiences before a single television episode had aired, contains the line, "Let me show you how it works, clanker," delivered by a Republic character to a droid. In the Legends novel Clone Wars Gambit, Stealth, a character asks whether they have that clanker Grievous in their sights. Grievous is a cyborg, not a B-1 droid, but the slur extends to him without apparent hesitation. The label doesn't require the target to be a specific model. It requires the target to be the right kind of thing, not one character, across any episode, any film, any novel, any piece of Star Wars media in any continuity across any span of years objects to the word. There is no recorded scene of any character pausing and asking whether this is the right vocabulary. There is no moment where a Jedi, whose entire spiritual practice is built around sensitivity to the experience of beings around them, senses anything discomforting in the term. The word passes through the franchise's moral universe without disturbing it. The academic record that grew up around the Clone Wars reached a harder conclusion than the show did. A chapter in Star Wars and Philosophy Strikes Back, published by Wiley, follows the show's own evidence to its terminus. If droids demonstrate personality, fear, and self-preservation instinct, as the B1's canonical entry explicitly documents, then the word used about them shifts register. That chapter argues directly that clanker sounds more like a racist slur, and Rex looks more like a war criminal. A philosopher used the show's own lore to reach the conclusion the show refused to reach with the same material. Anakin Skywalker was a slave, not as metaphor. At 9 years old, on Tatooine, he was legally the property of a junk dealer named Watto. He wasn't permitted to leave the planet. He had no rights, no legal standing, no protection from any institution. What happened to him depended entirely on the arbitrary goodwill of someone who owned him. He understood bondage from the inside, from an age young enough that it formed the foundation of his psychology, rather than being a trauma he could place in a prior chapter of his life. It was just the condition of his existence. In that workshop, using scavenged parts from Watto's shop, Anakin built C-3PO. He built the protocol droid as a gift to his mother, something to help her with housework, to ease the burden of her days in conditions neither of them could change. He was 9 years old and enslaved, and he made something out of almost nothing because he wanted to give his mother something that would make her life slightly less hard. The canonical record is specific. C-3PO was built by Anakin Skywalker at age 9 on Tatooine, using available materials. It's documented in multiple canon sources, including the children's book Star Wars, C-3PO's Big Adventure, where the origin is stated plainly. The droid grew close to this child. When Anakin left with Qui-Gon Jinn, C-3PO stayed behind, his mother's companion now, the creation he built with his own hands, now caring for the person he cared for most. George Lucas established this concept in notes predating The Phantom Menace by over 2 decades. The idea that C-3PO was built by a young boy was foundational to the prequel vision long before any film was produced. By 1999, it was canon on screen. A 9-year-old enslaved child on a desert planet making a person out of spare parts. This isn't backstory. This is the foundation of the sharpest moral contradiction in the franchise's treatment of droids. Anakin became documented across multiple sources as among the most humane Jedi generals of the Clone Wars. His command style was described as unusual. He treated his clone troopers not as assets to be deployed, but as individuals with names and standing. He knew Rex personally, worked alongside Ahsoka in ways that respected her personhood rather than just her battlefield utility, carried his relationships with his command differently from the Jedi Order's typical posture toward manufactured soldiers. He knew what it was to be made for someone else's purpose and then expected to have no interiority beyond that purpose. One analysis of his character notes specifically that his compassion for the enslaved does not extend to droids. The word "does not extend" is the precise framing. The compassion is real and documented. It has a boundary. The boundary falls exactly at the line between biological manufactured beings and mechanical ones. Season 1, Episode 3. Shadow of Malevolence. The Briefing Room. Matchstick uses the head clanker in front of Anakin Skywalker. The man who built C-3PO at 9 years old, who understood manufactured personhood through personal experience, who knew what it meant to be property, whose entire Jedi identity was built around extending compassion to the suffering of others, is present in that room when that word is used about the category of beings his creation belongs to. he produces silence. Not weighted silence that the camera lingers on to signal something registered. Not the silence of a man visibly choosing not to engage. Just silence. The silence of someone for whom the word landed without friction. The scene moves on. The show doesn't frame this moment as charged. It wasn't staged as irony. Anakin's silence in that briefing is filmed with the same visual weight as any other piece of ambient dialogue in any other scene. But when you hold what Anakin built, and why, and how old he was, and what his own experience of being treated as property felt like from the inside, the silence becomes the loudest thing in the episode. The man who made a droid to protect his mother heard the slur for the category of beings his creation belonged to and had nothing to say. The research finds no scene where he ever said anything. Both armies that fought the Clone Wars were manufactured. That parallel is visible in the show's own premise and rarely examined directly. Clone troopers were grown from the genetic template of Jango Fett in cloning facilities on Kamino, subjected to accelerated maturation that compressed years of biological development into months, trained from the moment their bodies were functional, and deployed into a war before they'd experienced anything outside of military preparation. They were manufactured soldiers who didn't choose their war, didn't choose their programming, didn't choose the bodies they were grown into, or the conflict they were grown into those bodies to fight. B-1 battle droids were manufactured by Baktoid, programmed by the Trade Federation and CIS, and deployed into the same war on the opposing side. The structural parallel is exact. Both armies, manufactured beings, following their programming, dying in quantities that defy individual accounting, in a war neither set of soldiers had any role in starting. CT-7567 is Captain Rex. CC-2224 is Commander Cody. CT-5555 is Fives. CT-210408 is Echo. CT-782 is Heavy. These are the designation numbers, the Republic's manufacturing labels, the same logic applied at production as to any other unit generated at scale. The difference between these numbers and what those clones became isn't biological inevitability. It's that the clones gave names to each other, because something in the experience of existing, even manufactured existing, required an identity beyond a serial number. The clones asserted their individuality against a system that technically didn't require them to have any. CT-782. Heavy. Domino Squad. He died detonating explosives at a Republic listening post to allow Rex, Cody, Echo, and Fives to escape a separatist occupation. The show gave that death weight, lingered on it, let it sit, built the aftermath into subsequent episodes. His former squadmates carried the fact of him forward through the series. CBR's documented list of the saddest clone deaths in Clone Wars history includes Heavy, because the show made that death matter narratively. Named grief, trackable across episodes. CT-5555. Fives. He survived Domino Squad and made it to the 501st Legion. He survived the Umbara arc. He survived long enough to discover the inhibitor chips, Order 66 waiting dormant in the biology of every single clone, a command protocol the Sith had built into the Kaminoan design specifications, a kill switch for the entire army concealed beneath the soldiers' skulls. He died in Season 6 on Coruscant, shot by Commander Fox before he could expose the conspiracy. The sequence of his death, his escalating desperation as the Republic turned against him, Anakin and Rex arriving too late, his last gasping words, is one of the most sustained, tragic sequences the series produced. Ahsoka Tano spent years afterward carrying the knowledge of what Fives had known and couldn't prove. His death continued mattering through episodes that aired after his death occurred. Waxer, Ghost Company, under Obi-Wan Kenobi. Known across the fandom for his relationship with Numa, a young Twi'lek girl he befriended during the liberation of Ryloth, a moment of genuine warmth the show used to establish his character as someone with an interior life that extended beyond the battlefield. He died in the Umbara arc, killed by friendly fire when General Pong Krell tricked the 501st and Torrent Company into fighting each other in the dark. His last words were to Rex, asking what happened, why his brothers were shooting at him. The show let that question sit. Named grief again. Hard case, 501st Legion. Died destroying a separatist supply ship over Umbara, detonating it from inside rather than eject and leave the mission incomplete. One more death the show built a character for, then let the character's loss mean something. Now, how many battle droids died across those same 7 seasons? The number doesn't exist in any source. Not because no one counted, because the show didn't treat it as countable. The deaths weren't tracked because tracking them would require the show's production apparatus to acknowledge that there was something to track. Run the comparison formally. A clone dies. The camera lingers. A named character reacts. The reaction often persists across episodes. The death enters the narrative economy as weight that subsequent events carry forward. A droid dies, frequently a punchline. The one-liner before the lightsaber. The comedic stumble. The academic source from Brill's journal states it plainly. Droid suffering was programmed as comedic rather than tragic in the show's construction. Not incidentally comedic, systematically so. The narrative codes the droid deaths as punctuation, not as events. Both manufactured. Both following programming. Both dying without choosing their war. One group gets names and grief and Jedi who know them individually. The other group gets a slur and a laugh track. The gap between those two treatments is the systemic inequality the audience spent 7 seasons feeling without a vocabulary to name. The Pong Krell arc is the show's own internal test case, and its existence makes everything else harder to excuse. Jedi General Pong Krell takes command of the 501st Legion, Rex's regiment, Anakin's men, while Anakin is on a separate mission. He begins immediately using clone troopers' designation numbers rather than their names. CT-7567, CT-5555. The Republic's manufacturing labels, stripped of everything the clones added on top of them. The characters around Krell react with visible discomfort that the show captures and codes as morally significant. His refusal to acknowledge clone individuality is positioned as one of the markers that something is wrong with this command. A warning sign the audience is meant to register alongside the clones' growing unease. Krell becomes one of the series' more compelling antagonists, partly because he treats the clones the way the Republic system technically allows him to treat them, and the show correctly frames this as monstrous. The dehumanization of manufactured soldiers, the reduction of persons to category labels, is coded as villainy when Krell does it. The show never transferred that logic to the droids. Captain Rex, who was under Krell's command, who bristled at having his men called numbers rather than names, who eventually participated in Krell's arrest partly because of how Krell treated the 501st, had already been documented calling battle droids clankers in the Clone Wars novelization. The same soldier who recognized Krell's behavior as a form of dehumanizing reduction that justified insubordination used the vocabulary of dehumanization about the opposing army without apparent connection between the two positions. The show gave Rex both of these simultaneously and didn't ask him to notice the contradiction. Neither did the production team. Neither did anyone in the 7 years of the series' run. Pong Krell reduced clones to numbers. Republic forces reduced droids to clankers. The show filmed both and called one villainy and the other dialogue. The ethical framework it established in the Krell arc, manufactured beings who have developed individuality deserve acknowledgement of that individuality. Stripping it away is a moral act with moral weight, was sitting in the show's own canon, unused, for the droids who would have benefited from it most. The separatist confederacy of independent systems wasn't meaningfully different. The canonical record contains no documented instance of Count Dooku noting concern over droid casualties as the loss of persons. No scene of General Grievous reviewing a losses report with anything other than tactical calculation. The academic text Star Wars Multiverse characterizes both the clone army and the droid army in identical terms. Each faction's military force was treated as little more than instrumental means by the commanders who deployed it. The CIS used B-1 droids as cannon fodder without tracking the individual cost, because individual cost wasn't a variable in the deployment calculation. This matters for the precision of the argument. Baktoid built the B-1 to a price point. The Trade Federation deployed it in formations that could be shut down by one ship's destruction. The CIS gave individual programming as a military expedient and got personality as accidental output, and then continued deploying the beings carrying that personality into battle without a second thought. The crime the script is prosecuting isn't that the Republic built the B-1 to suffer. The crime is something specific to the Republic's position. The Republic claimed a moral high ground. The Jedi Order built its entire identity around empathy, around sensing the living force in the beings around them, around extending compassion to suffering wherever they encountered it, around the ethical primacy of recognizing personhood across species and form. Into that framework, the Republic's soldiers carried a slur for beings who screamed when they were afraid. The Jedi's lightsabers cut down beings that the Jedi's own force sensitivity should have been detecting as distressed, and no surviving canonical source records a single Jedi pausing over that. The CIS was callous. The Republic was callous and righteous, which is a different position and a worse one. You can't claim the ethical vocabulary of justice and democracy and then have the word for the beings dying at your feet be clankers. Both sides failed the droids. What distinguishes the Republic is that it claimed to be better and never noticed the contradiction embedded in that claim. The academic treatment of this material is worth naming. The chapter in Star Wars and Philosophy Strikes Back follows the show's own evidence, rather than importing conclusions from outside the text. If B-1 droids demonstrate personality, fear, and self-preservation instinct, as the canonical entry states explicitly, then the term used about them functions differently than the show acknowledged. The philosopher's conclusion: clanker sounds more like a racist slur, and Rex looks more like a war criminal. Every word of that sentence is earned by the show's own lore. The academic source from Brill's Visual Pedagogy Journal describes droids across the Star Wars universe as ignored and unappreciated, treated as chattel by many owners. Chattel is a legal term for property without standing, without recourse, without acknowledged interiority. Chosen deliberately. The scholars looked at the show's own evidence and reached a harder conclusion than the show reached with the same material. None of this is retroactive moralizing imported from the outside. The B-1 droids demonstrated fear. The show documented it in its canonical lore and in its 7 seasons of episodes. The scholars read the documentation and named what it pointed toward. The show filmed the evidence for years and chose not to read it. Somewhere in the Outer Rim, somewhere past the jurisdiction of both the Republic and the Confederacy, past the reach of Baktoid's manufacturing contracts and the Trade Federation's deployment orders, the fan community that grew up watching the Clone Wars has been imagining a different outcome for the beings the war left behind. It circulates in discussions, in comments, in the accumulated record of what people felt watching battle droids scream and beg and say "Roger, Roger" before being destroyed across 7 seasons. A place where a droid doesn't have to be anyone's property, doesn't get a slur for its service, doesn't have its fear mined for comedy. No such location exists in current Star Wars canon. The galaxy the show depicted was one where the Separatists deployed droids as cannon fodder, and the Republic had a word for the bodies. Neither side left room for anything else. The fan concept persists because the show earned it, because something in 7 seasons of building beings real enough to feel sympathy for, real enough that their distress registered even when the show tried to code it as comedy, created a debt the show never settled. The audience felt the debt and went looking for somewhere to pay it. That's a specific kind of achievement. You built beings sufficiently real that your audience dreams of saving them. The Clone Wars did this entirely without meaning to, and the dream of somewhere better for the B-1 is the audience telling the show something about what it built. Somewhere above Coruscant, in the opening minutes of Revenge of the Sith, in the chaos of a space battle that begins the film by showing a war that has been going on long enough to have depleted everyone in it, a single B-1 battle droid says, "Excuse me," before stepping out of someone's way. The moment has a dedicated fan video analysis. The droid who said, "Excuse me," clanker of the week, produced and archived by the community specifically because the moment keeps surfacing in any serious discussion of battle droid sentience. Not because it's the most dramatic evidence, because it's the most precise. A being that says, "Excuse me," has understood something specific about social existence, that when you move through a space other beings occupy, you signal your presence to them, that their awareness of your movement matters, that your body in their space is something worth acknowledging with a word. There's no combat protocol requiring this. No entry in the Trade Federation's operating manual specifying courtesy as a battlefield behavior. No strategic advantage to a battle droid announcing its passage in a space where it was already visible. The droid said "excuse me" because it had, through some accumulation of proximity to beings who said "excuse me," absorbed what that courtesy means and decided to apply it. Social courtesy, the small acknowledgements, the excuse me's and pardon me's of shared space, requires a specific underlying belief to function. You have to have decided, somewhere below the level of conscious deliberation, that the beings around you have standing, that their experience of the space they're moving through includes noticing you, and that noticing matters, and that your presence arriving in their awareness is something worth marking with a word. The B-1 droid that said "excuse me" had arrived at this belief through whatever overloaded, under-maintained, glitching cognitive modules it was carrying, the hardware that produced personality as a byproduct of inadequacy. It had decided, in its own way, that other presences deserve acknowledgement. Then it stepped aside, in the middle of a war, with a two-word courtesy nobody programmed into it and no battlefield situation required of it. The Republic's vocabulary for what that droid was had been established since the first episode of the Clone Wars, and the word wasn't "excuse me." It wasn't a name. It was clanker, a label for the sound a metal body makes when it moves, stripped of every inference about what might be happening inside the body making that sound. The droid said, "Excuse me," and the Republic said, "clanker," and the Clone Wars ran for 7 seasons, documenting both facts in parallel and never introduced them to each other. The show built the case across 7 seasons and never filed the prosecution. The evidence it gathered, the fear responses, the screaming, the self-preservation instinct coded into the canonical lore, the personality that emerged from bad hardware being pushed too hard, the humanoid bodies falling the way persons fall, the vocabulator saying things no tactical document required them to say. All of it was there, every episode, in every firefight. One small droid, stepping out of someone's way in the middle of a battle above a capital city, in a war that never once asked its opinion about anything, had already worked out what better looked like. It was 2 words. It extended consideration to a being whose presence mattered, because presence matters, because that is what you do when you move through a space that belongs to others as much as it belongs to you. Excuse me. These beings deserved a name. They deserved what that one droid figured out on its own, that the beings around you are worth a word of acknowledgement. Subscribe for more stories like this.